How Puerto Ricos are being enslaved. Let's start in the beginning. Puerto Rican slaves in 1872. The numbers do not lie. US slavery commenced around 1618 and ended in 1668. Puerto Rico slavery began in 1494 and ended in 1873. That's 375 years of slavery in Puerto Rico versus 250 years of slavery in the United States. So Puerto Ricans suffer 125 more years, 51.6% more years of slavery than the United States did. The argument that Puerto Ricans are not all descended from slaves, so they can't all expect reparation, does not hold up for several reasons. Number one, all of the original Puerto Ricans, aka the Taino people, had a fate worse than slavery. They were exterminated. Number two, in addition to slavery, every Puerto Rican, black, white, trigueño, criollo, was victimized by outright land theft, a 40% currency devaluation, and flesh-eating loans. Black slaves were imported to replace the exterminated Taino by the year 1840. There were 50,000 slaves in Puerto Rico, and the entire island's population was roughly 400,000. In other words, 1 in 8, or 12.5%, of Puerto Ricans were slaves. This slave to overall population ratio in Puerto Rico was nearly identical to that of the United States, with its 2.5 million slaves and an overall population of 19.5 million residents in 1840. These mainland numbers yield the same ratio. 1 in 8 US residents were slaves in 1840. Number 3. In Puerto Rico today, consumers' prices are 15 to 20% higher for every product: food, cars, clothes, toiletries, computers, TVs, Kellogg's, cornflakes, etc., than anywhere in the US mainland due to Section 27 of the Merchant Marine Law, aka the Jones Act. Every Puerto Rican, black, white, trigueño, criollo, has suffered from this law since 1920. Number 4. There was no minimum wage in Puerto Rico until 1937. Every Puerto Rican family, regardless of race, suffered from this wage discrimination. Number 5. Puerto Ricans were declared U.S. citizens in March 1917, just 1 month before the U.S. marched into World War I. What a coincidence. For over a century, its men have been drafted and wounded and killed in every US military conflict. This includes every color, and even not only racial segregation, but also linguistic segregation. For Puerto Ricans who can speak fluent English were joined with the white soldiers, and those who cannot speak English joined with the black soldiers. And there was a all Puerto Rican only military group called the Borinqueniers. It was the only all Latino Spanish speaking segregated military troop in US history. Number 6. Every Puerto Rican, regardless of skin color, is paying the highest sales tax in the United States, 12.5%, paying 200% more for their electricity, breathing toxic air, suffering from crippling infrastructure, reeling from 400 school closures, and staggering island-wide blackouts, and all of these are attributable to the boundless appetite to Wall Street and Washington, D.C. Number 7. The island's legislature did exactly what Wall Street, creditors, and bond-ready agencies demand. Like, for example, thanks to Act 22, it is a tax haven for the rich. People like Jake Paul live in the island so that they do not have to pay taxes, and it's a breeding ground for Bitcoin. As of 2010, it has laid off over 20,000 workers, raised prices for water, gasoline, and electricity, increased property, sales, and small business taxes, cut public pensions and health benefits, raised the retirement age, and closed hundreds of schools. From 2013 to 14, 105 different taxes were raised in Puerto Rico. Every islander, regardless of skin color, is paying for the alleged $73 billion in debt to Wall Street. In addition to all the above pathologies and the 51.6% more years of slavery in Puerto Rico than the US, there's two more key points. Number one, using quotes or numbers, the misery index of Puerto Rico exceeds that of North Landale. The homicide rate of North Landale was 45 per 100,000, but in Puerto Rico is 622 per 100,000. 43% of North Landale live below the poverty line, while Puerto Rico is 45%. The entire island suffered from ridiculing mortgage abuse and predatory lending in every level of its infrastructure. So when the Cortes declared that 250 years of slavery and an ongoing war on black people entitled the people of North Landwell to racial preparation, the exact same argument applies to the people of Puerto Rico. But the Puerto Rican reparation should come first, since their slavery commenced over a century before that of the US and officially lasted 51.6% years longer, plus their land was stolen, their currency was devalued by 40%, their wages were unconstitutionally suppressed, and the war against all Puerto Ricans continued to this day. Number two, the argument that slavery did not exist. In Puerto Rico, when the US purchased it from Spain, which was $3 million by the way, thus the US is not responsible for any prior harm inflicted before 1898, is completely without merit. Here's some basic property law. Wherever you buy a building, bridge, boat, or corporation, any piece of property, the buyer assumes all the assets and liabilities of that property, include any antecedent lines, claims, or debt. And so, when the US purchased Puerto Rico, they not only assumed the island's wealth, they also assumed responsibility for all of its antecedent debt. If the US owes reparation of the mainland for injuries inflicted by slavery, it must owe the same reparation for the depredations of slavery in Puerto Rico. In addition, the US cannot claim any defense of surprise or latent defect in the Puerto Rican psyche and character since they, the US, were entirely unnoticed. They know the public record of prior slavery in Puerto Rico. It was fully disclosed historical fact, and the consequence of the fact wrong with the property. They are completely assumed by the buyer, in this case the US. Accordingly, I do not resent Cortes' cry for racial reparation. I welcome it, because by every conceivable measure and using the same yardstick, the crimes committed against Puerto Ricans are more persuasive, pernicious, and permanent than the crime against all the other races. But that doesn't mean we are against them. We are believe in solidarity of all racial minorities who are suppressed, like the African American people who should create their own nation called the Republic of New African, and the rise of the Black Lives Matter and the rebirth of black separatism, the same for the Chicano movement, for the Mexican Americans, for the creation of Aztlan, and for the indigenous native people of the United States who did an insurrection of the Wounded Knee in 1973 to create the Republic of Lakota. All these should be supported for their struggle. Pietro Pierluisi was a pit bull attorney. He won $180 million in damages for the government of Peru and was from 1993 to 1997 the Secretary of Justice of Puerto Rico, but he never made any real money until 2008, where he became the island's resident commissioner. And this is where the main statement of how Puerto Ricans are being enslaved today. A resident commissioner is a non-voting member of US Congress. They can attend committees, hearings, and introduce legislation. They can't vote on any bills, not even their own, but in restless hands, the position can be as US Treasury printing press. Pietro Pierluisi printed early and often. He knew that oil companies had kicked back hundreds of millions of dollars to Puerto Rico and their politicians. So if Pierluisi could single-handedly shut out those oil companies and make liquid natural gas, the principal energy source for Prepa, the LNG industry, will make him as rich as Croesus. As far back as 2013, with Aurelian Sauvete, Pierluisi was pushing Jones Act reform bills for the LNG industry, but this reform was actually a Jones Act scam. keeping nearly every portion of Jones firmly planted on Puerto Rico's neck, while using it to carve a surgically precise monopoly for his LNG sponsor and their chartered ships. Previously, he arranged congregational hearings. This is the sixth hearing in the past 11 months while he was in as a governor, before we kick him out, thankfully, with one obsessive purpose to make liquefied natural gas the fuel for all of Prepa. Year after year, he announced that Prepa must switch from heavy reliance on petroleum fuel to greater dependence on domestic liquefied natural gas from the U.S. Gulf. He also mentioned that the Congress should enact my legislation in the Puerto Rico Interstate Commerce Improvement Act in order to increase the number of maritime vessels authorized by the transport LNG and liquefied petroleum gas from ports in the U.S. mainland to ports in Puerto Rico. On January 2nd, 2016, at the hearing before the House Committee on Natural Resources, Pierluisi supported the creation of a board that helped the Puerto Rican government improve its fiscal practice. And correction, we didn't kick out Pierluisi, it was Ricky. My mistake. And then again, ad nauseum, he reminded the Congress members that they should enact my legislation to increase the number of ships qualified to transport LNG from the state to Puerto Rico. Is it largely obtained by fracking? Yes, it is, with severe environmental consequences such as methane and nitrogen oxide emissions, extremely global warming, and increasing 1.5 million gallons of water per well. And doesn't those millions of gallons become toxic frac fluid which gets poured back into the water supplies? Isn't Puerto Rico desperately trying to end its energy dependency of foreign overpriced and toxic fossil fuel? They did not matter, because for him, he sailed on like Captain Ahab, obsessed with his mission, his eye glued to the great white whale of LNG and the fast fortunes it will disgorge upon him. Is building three new LNG import terminals in San Juan, Mayagüez, and Yabucao, which are almost in completion or already in completion. When PREPA releases any RFPs for fuel option, one of those options must always be LNG. Today, they to provide 45 to 50% of all their power generation within 5 years. Its recent CEO, Jose Ortiz, touted energy as the best, cleanest option to cure PREPA overdependence on oil. His successor, interim CEO Efrain Paredes Mayosonet, espoused the same view. Simply state the governor that interim CEO Paredes Mayosonet are planning to replace diesel with LNG for the entire energy grid of Puerto Rico instead of using natural energy because of fucking tropical island. In 2019, with much fanfare, the government of Puerto Rico enacted a law which committed the island to 100% renewable energy by 2050, which is a bold-faced lie because they're doing Chicago style of shock doctrine, Pinochet capitalism, of privatizing everything. The press emphasized that the system will rely on solar arrays, power distributed microgrids, so that if the infrastructure went out on a part of the island, especially during a hurricane, it wouldn't impact other areas. But now in 2021, this committee is all smoke and mirrors. When the government of Luisi building a liquid natural gas infrastructure for PREPA, which locks in a centralized power grid and forced consumption of LNG for decades to come, his plan is already being implemented with three LNG processing plants building seamlessly overnight in San Juan, in the Capo Seco plant, Mayagüez, and Yabucao. The bait and switch is nothing new in Puerto Rico. In December 2017, the Puerto Rican legislature introduced this bill to shift 50% of the island's power to renewable energy by 2050. By the very next month, on January 2018, the governor Ricky Rosselló announced that PREPA, the Puerto Rico Electrical Power Authority, would be privatized. This move, combined with the financial management from the Financial Control Board, and that ended the island's shift to renewable energy. Puerto Rico's power grid is managed by PREPA and fueled by foreign oil. This bears repetition. all of the electricity of Puerto Rico is generated by import foreign oil, coal, and LNG. This island has no oil reserve of its own, so residents are utterly dependent on foreign oil, coal, and LNG to light their highways, run their waters, reservoirs, recharge their computers, power their homes, stores, churches, office buildings, supermarkets, shopping malls, factories, schools, hospitals, refrigerators, air conditioners, and electric power cars. As of 2020, the proportions are as follows: 49.5% petroleum, 29% LNG, 19% coal, and 2.5% renewable energy. As I said it again, currently in Puerto Rico, all of their electric dependency on imported oil, coal, and LNG. For this reason, the development of alternative power sources, which is natural energy, will not only generate energy for Puerto Ricans, it will begin to generate their independence. They could no longer depend the outside world for all their energy needs. The people of Puerto Rico are aware of this. Over the past 4 years, in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria and 6-month island-wide electrical blackout, there has been a groundswell of support for the phase-out PREPA and phase in the development of cheaper, more reliable, and alternative energy sources. This is quite feasible since wind, sun, and ocean water surround Puerto Rico on all sides, and so the government has an historic opportunity and personal choice between the future of his people, which he did not did by the way, and the future of personal finances, which he failed by the way. Worldwide, the price of renewable energy will soon drop until the capital is trying to monopolize it, which is gonna happen anyway unless we do a revolution. But Puerto Rico does not have the resources to build out one island-wide energy grid and then replace it with another one just a few years later. If the government continues his aggression, shock capitalism, a Pinochet Chicago boy style, rams LNG down Puerto Rico's throat, he will imprison the island into LNG economy and doom it to decades of fossil fuel slavery. The true independence of Puerto Rico can only begin with one thing: must abandon its drive to become a billionaire, these people in power, by enslaving Puerto Rico to LNG, and let the nature do its job of dialectical naturalism of social ecology of Murai Puchen is the answer for Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico has a new national anthem, originally recorded by Johnny Guitar Watson in 1976. He expressed the new national spirit and political consciousness of Puerto Rico 2021. It's called Ain't That a Bitch. You can hear it on YouTube. And this latest slick move from downtown is a reconstruction support agreement, executed on May 3, 2019 by PREPA, the Puerto Rico Fiscal, Energy, and Financial Advisory Authority, Assured Guaranty Corp., Assured Guaranty Municipal Corp., and the ad hoc group of PREPA bondholders. The ad hoc group and the Financial Control Bond are in charge of this horrible economy. These RSA calls for issuance of more bond debt of $8.3 billion in order to pay off bondholders. This debt will be paid by the people of Puerto Rico via so-called transition charge, which starts at 2.7 additional cents per kilowatt hour and eventually raised to $4.55. Amazingly, even PREPA customers who install rooftop solar panels will have to pay this transition charge, even on the solar energy which they themselves generate. The PREPA customer will also be legally obligated to buy at their own expense, roughly $1,000. That's ignoring the taxes. An additional meter, which measures the amount of solar power they are generating and using. According to Mike Henshin, a utility system expert at Rocky Mountain Institute, he is unaware of any utility in the US that charges customers for solar panels, and he did not generate, in other words, mine, not henchman. This RSA is a shakedown, a familiar phenomenon at PREPA. In recent years, reports have shown that one, for decades, PREPA used illegal toxic sludge oil instead of EPA-compliant petroleum and falsified over 600 lab reports to avoid detection. And two, from 2009 to 2013, during the Fortunio administration, PREPA issued 7 successive AA bonds, and 80% of each bond was used to pay off the interest, not the principal, just the interest, of the immediate preceding bond. This Ponzi scheme practice was consistent with Fortunio's orgy of debt. In his one and only 4-year term, he settled the island with more debt than any other governor in Puerto Rican history, over $14 billion. And now the people of Puerto Rico will pay for this reckless debt with higher tolls of privatized highways and bridges, higher tuition in charter schools, higher water rates, and the highest electricity rate in all of the United States. The current island rate, even before the RSA, is already 22 cents per kilowatt hour, and within 3 years, 2024, Puerto Ricans will pay 30% per kilowatt, an overall rate hike of 73%. Then, as reported by London Economic International, the electricity rate will more than double again to 64.5 cents per kilowatt by 2036. This is nearly triple what they are today, inflicted on a vulnerable population whose per capita income is half that of Mississippi, the poorest state in the US. The RSA grip on the island will span 2 generations. Under its $8.3 billion settlement terms, the transition charge will be paid every year for the next 47 years. Ironically, this de facto serfdom arrives at the same time that Senators Chuck Schumer and Representative Nydia Vasquez announced in FEMA granting of $9.46 billion for PREPA's development of clean, renewable electricity, quote unquote. But in a Citizens United world with both the governor and residence commissioner deeply committed to LNG interests and with multi-billion-dollar fuel contract at stake, it's only a matter of time before those FEMA monies enter a black hole of lobbyists and influence blending all powder and protected by the highest authority, the US Supreme Court, via a Citizens United decision. Ultimately, the Financial Control Board, La Junta, will exercise the jurisdiction over that $9.46 billion and falling toward the bondholder debt. The LNG tsunami and of course a few shekels will find their way into the governor's pocket. Because in Puerto Rico, somebody's always doing something slick. And not even that. American corporation and company, for example, the Museum of Modern Arts, is exploiting is betting they're gambling on the life and death of the Puerto Rican race itself. Daniel Orch was snapping up Puerto Rico municipal bonds, and Daniel short Tanabon the ropes. Daniel's bonds were triple tax exempt. That means no federal, state, or municipal taxes. Under federal law, Puerto Rico are prohibited from filing for Chapter 11 bankruptcy and are thus unable to protect themselves or renegotiate their payment. So these assholes, the rich people, will get do any tactic they want to give us more into economic disaster while they themselves get rich. An entirely separate source of revenue, the Puerto Rican sales tax, have been created to pay and to guarantee the payment of these Puerto Rico bonds. The sales tax will be a whopping 11.5%, the highest sales tax anywhere in the United States. This tax will be applied to the highest price produced in US thanks to the Jones Act. If any Puerto Rican complained, the US Congress was sending down a financial control board to commandeer the entire island's economy, close their schools, cut their pensions, and force Puerto Ricans to pay their so-called debt. In this way, the municipal bond could all invest a few pennies, demand a full dollar's return, and the US government will operate as their collective agency. And that's why we are shouting, because Tannenbaum is not sentimental. He's monetizing things, invests on the life or death of Puerto Ricans. And now he's betting on the death of Puerto Rico itself. The Cofina bonds, purchased and promoted by Tannenbaum, are all illegal. They exceed the legal debt limit of the Commonwealth government and violate Section 6 of the Constitution of Puerto Rico. But Tannenbaum does not care about legality. He invokes it only for economic expedience. He does not care about the 300 schools closing Puerto Rico, hundreds of thousands losing their pensions, or the entire island paying 11.5% sales tax in order to ensure a $1 billion profit for Mr. Tannenbaum. Because for Tarabu and most of Wall Street, Puerto Rico has become a punching bag, a feeding trough, a place to grab a fortune no matter how or how many it hurts. The place where fine citizens can become psychopaths, leading characters in Caribbean version of Westworld or The Purge, before heading back to the mainland with a clear conscience, albeit a psychopath, to resume their real roles among the real human society. Taliban knows that the U.S. To the U.S. Puerto Rico is an invisible island. He knows that whatever crimes he commits on the island, whatever pain he inflicts on the island, the U.S. public will still view him as a public servant, dedicated philanthropist, a patron of the arts, and that's why hundreds of Puerto Ricans must shout because we are dying because of him. Our economic crumbling is going to murder us. And here's a fun fact. The United States are selling Puerto Rican children. Puerto Rican children are about to be sold by the US Department of Education. You think I'm making this shit up? Well, back in 2018-2017, in October 61 members of US Congress delivered an official letter to US Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos. The letter urged the release of the immediate emergency funds for the island's educational system. Even before Hurricane Maria, from 2010 to 15, 150 schools were closed in Puerto Rico, and in the year 2017, another 179 public schools. Right now, it's roughly around 500. Over 50% of schools in Puerto Rico are closed. That's more than one third of schools that exist in Puerto Rico barely exist. So the children are up for sale. 3 weeks after receiving the urgent letter from 61 members of Congress, the U.S. Secretary of Education finally visited the island for one day on November 8, 2017. She didn't visit any open schools. She didn't meet with a single teacher, by the way. She visited one closed school in the capital San Juan, the Loaiza Cordero Elementary School, about 1 mile from the governor's mansion. She glanced at it from the outside. She then had a private meeting with the Secretary Calejer and the Governor Rosselló at the time that she announced that the United States, the richest country in the world, would generously donate $2 million in federal money to help rebuild Puerto Rico's storm-wrecked schools. So the children are for sale. Both Secretary of Education Devos and Kelleher had announced their aggressive plan to privatize as many schools as possible. And the former governor, hopefully declared a war on public schools, which is why he is closing as many of them as possible, as quickly as possible, and keeping them closed. The DeVos trip from Washington, D.C. had nothing to do with helping to rebuild Puerto Rico's damaged schools. Her insulting $2 million donation proves it, since $2 million is barely enough to fix even one school. No, the purpose for the trip is like the foundation for the widespread privatization of the school system. This privatization plan already existed before the hurricane, and now they see the opportunity to accelerate it. It's keeping his end of the bargain, the governor. Rosselló stated selling public schools from the moment he took office. Even before Hurricane Maria, in just one short year, Rosselló closed more schools than any other governor in the history of the island. Now in 2018, he and his Secretary of Education will need to is keep the schools closed for as long as possible and then let Secretary Devo swoop in with hedge funds, lobbyists, lawyers from the United States to save, quote unquote, the Puerto Rican education system and to brainwash us with propaganda of American exceptionalism and American centrism. And of course, the government of Puerto Rico is heavy hedge fund and lobbyists from billionaire named Betsy DeVos. And now the Puerto Rican people are protesting for the decolonization of the island. It is now or never, and we have to achieve absolute independence from the island and establish a new government system away from the old established new. As an anarchist, I believe in a stateless, classless, moneyless, non-hierarchical society. But it looks like my ideas are too radical for most Puerto Ricans. So at the absolute best, it will be some form of Marxist government. And even then is stretching it. So I just hope that for now, This message will show you the horrible nature of slavery that's covering in Puerto Rico and why we need to support all we want. No amount of reform, no about ballot box, no amount of voting will change anything. If you want systematic change, it's in the end of a barrel of a bullet.